Welcome back to the Anxious Tradeswoman podcast, where I, your host, Louise as a party, shares the things that I learned through the tears, through the years, so you don't have to. So this is episode 11. It's kind of surreal, but anyway. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about unconscious bias. So unconscious bias gets thrown around a lot, but I really want to go into this episode of what it is, how it can affect us, and what we can do to change it. This will be a bit of rehashing some other stuff, but I think it is really valuable to do this as a standalone episode. So then you can, if you feel like you are coming up against unconscious bias, that you can pick this up and do something about it. So what I mean by unconscious bias is people's learned behavior that they just believe is normal because it's what they either grew up with, were taught at school, or how society was like in their generation. Often it is subtle or something that just doesn't sit right, and until you sit and reflect on it, you feel like there's just something not right. So the reason why understanding unconscious bias is so important is because when we have a good understanding of the ways it can show up, it allows us to have more productive conversations to change their unconscious bias. If we do not understand where it comes from and pick up on the signals in people's words and actions, the way that we approach them about it may not be as effective as when we can pinpoint and have a straight conversation. So when we're vague, the person doesn't know what to change, and it can seem like we might be attacking their personality or beliefs if we don't have a straight answer for them or straight feedback. We have often been in the position ourselves with someone who has given us vague feedback, and it doesn't allow us to create any change because we don't know what to change. And this is something that I go into more detail about in the episode about having difficult conversations. So one of the benefits of understanding unconscious bias is the ability to have effective conversations that create change. The reason why I tell you this is because unconscious bias has gotten under my skin before and taken my energy, and some of you may be able to relate to this story. So I rock up to work just like any other day. My mental health at this point in my life is a bit so-so. We get into the work, and I can't remember exactly what job we were doing that day, but whatever it was, the component that we were reinstalling broke as we were putting it in. A bit annoying, right? But it happens. So we ordered a new part, and it gets delivered later that day. While I was waiting for the part to be delivered, I started working on another machine, and for some reason it just was not going smoothly. But the parts arrived, so let's put that aside for a second. The guy who delivered the part is lovely, but he always says how nice it is that I'm doing this work as a woman. This is our regular parts guy, and today I just did not want to hear that. My mind had been spiraling downhill with each little thing that had gone wrong and happened that day. And in my state of mind, I took his "how lovely that you're doing this" as I shouldn't be doing this. And it all got too much. And then I went to my favorite cry spot and broke down. So from situations similar to this that have been happening to me for the last 12 years, I've learned to have effective conversations that can dismantle this unconscious bias. Step 1 to having effective conversations. For 10 years I have learned to have the effective conversations that can dismantle this unconscious bias. So step 1 to having effective conversations is to work out their why without asking why. So asking someone why they think a certain way makes them defensive. It makes them want to stand up for what they believe in, which is not where we want to go if you want to have an effective conversation. In this situation, you can replace the question, "Why would you say that?" with, "Can you tell me more about what led you to think that?" Or say that. Now, after asking them that question, you may need to give them a minute because they're going to go back through their mind, through their memories about what led them to say that comment. And a lot of the times they will come to the conclusion that it's not necessary to say what they said on their own. If they don't, the next step is to take the information that they've given you and let them see that from your angle. So that goes back to that episode on having difficult conversations, which is episode 9, so just 2 episodes before, where I go into detail about how to have those difficult conversations that can create change. And like unconscious bias, it pops up in the randomest places. Like we all have it. It's literally a function of the human brain. So unconscious bias is pretty much how our brain deletes, distorts, and something else. I was just in a course where we were talking about this. Deletes, distorts, and generalizes all the information that we're given. And we've got all these filters that it goes through. And that's what the unconscious bias is generally when we're talking about women in male-dominated spaces, so many men have been taught to delete women because they're just not around. Like they just don't pay attention to women, to female names on resumes, say they come up. They automatically delete that person from their mind as a good candidate because they've always been taught that women don't work in these workplaces, so they don't consider them. And even just with saying things like, oh, it's nice. And I also had this situation when I was in Russia. So as you know, I competed in the International World Skills Competition in Abu Dhabi in 2017. And in 2019, I went over and volunteered at the international competition in Russia. And I was there and I was an operational volunteer, just, there to do things. And the manager of the section, he was from Canada, lovely guy, and I was pretty much being his assistant in the competition and like with running the competition. So he had asked me to move some tables, some plastic tables, and I went to move them. And this guy from, God, I haven't told this story in ages. I can't remember. Latvia? I think he was from Latvia. And he had watched me compete and judged me in the previous international competition. So he knew I was a mechanic. He saw me do the same work that mechanics do. But he was like, oh, no, you can't move that. And I just looked at him and I said, oh, why can't I do that? He's like, oh, because, women, they don't do those kind of things. And I looked at him and I'm like, why? Well, I can do it. I've got 2 arms and 2 legs, and if I needed help, I'd ask. And then he kind of was like, oh, but yeah, usually in our country, like the women don't really do like the physical work. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm a person. I can ask you for help if I need help. And you could just kind of see his mind explode, that everything that he had been taught was getting rearranged because, that was just the norm. That was just, that's just how it was or is in his like place of living, in his culture. And it doesn't mean that he didn't want me to succeed. It's just that he saw a woman lifting something and his mind is, I need to help her because that's what we do. Yeah, and it was just one of those moments where I was looking into his eyes and I could almost see his brain working. And that's kind of, sometimes it's the conversations we need to have with people around us. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about sexism, which is like unconscious bias on steroids, but on purpose. Unconscious bias is in the name, it's unconscious. People are generally not doing it on purpose, which then gives us those opportunities to have conversations that create change. But yeah, so usually we go to the unconscious bias conversations, just a softer conversation that allows them to see it from our point of view. Whether, like I've said in previous episodes, I'm talking about my experience as a white woman in a male-dominated industry, but I can see this kind of stuff working for all minorities that have their unconscious biases, like from the community and from society, put on them. Tell people, hey, like, why did you do that? Like, what caused you to do that? I don't see you doing that to anyone else. Just to get them to think about it, to double check what they've got going on in their head, to, give them the opportunity to be like, oh yeah, that's right. That's what I've learnt my whole life is not actually real. Like, I can adjust my behavior because the behavior that I automatically do affects you negatively. So, on that note, this episode is proudly sponsored by the Talkin app. So, I really love the Talkin app. We're talking about unconscious bias. Talkin. Anyway, we've been talking about unconscious bias, and one thing that I really love about the Talkin app, which is pretty much like Facebook for anyone who works on mining equipment, everyone's fair game, no matter where in the world you are. Your knowledge is valid. No matter if you're male, female, or a person of color, we're all on there for knowledge. And yeah, the Talkin app is the sponsor of this podcast. And if you would really like to support this podcast and you're interested in downloading the Talkin app, you can do it through the link in the podcast description. It helps support this podcast to keep running. And, the Talkin app is a really great resource. So also, if you have any questions or want to get in contact with me for some coaching or anything like that, please, you can follow me on Instagram at Louise as a Party Coaching, or you can join my Facebook community, Tradeswomen Owning Their Power, which is for tradeswomen and tradespeople and the people that support us. And it's an amazing community. So I will talk to you guys next episode. Thank you for listening.